Hi, I'm Dr. Catherine Lito, and I'll be talking to you today about digital and data literacies for inclusion of marginalized citizens in learning cities. So first, I'll just say a little bit about myself. I'm a social psychologist by training. My area was in stereotyping and prejudice, but I began to get interested in learning and who was being excluded from learning. And that's led me to consider novel data and novel methodologies to try and capture the learning that goes on at the urban city level, national level. And so you can follow me on Twitter at Catherine Lito or at Urban Big Data, which is the Urban Big Data Center where I am Associate Director. So what is the Urban Big Data Center? It's a research center jointly funded by ESRC and the University of Glasgow with the remit of trying to get citizens, stakeholders, local government organizations to use the data that's out there and to apply innovative methods to try and tackle social, economic, and environmental well-being in cities. So go ahead and head over to the website and you can see some of the webinars that we've had going on. We've got upskilling, we've got academic research, we've got urban environmental transportation research and so on, and lots going on in light of COVID. Within UBDC, I'm the lead of the Educational Disadvantage in Place team. Basically, we're a work package that's trying to look at all forms of learning, school, FE, HE, less formal types of learning, and to look at how learning across the lifespan can be associated with lots of positive things for the city. Happy, healthier citizens, achieving more in their jobs, and even living longer is some of the literature. So this is some of our team. So what's a learning city? Many people are familiar with future cities, smart cities, but not so much with learning cities. It takes into account that we have an aging population, that more and more people are dwelling in cities. And so this brings along particular challenges to social inclusion, fast changing technologies, knowledge economy, diversity, and sustainability. So it's mainly led by UNESCO, the UNESCO Institute for Lifelong Learning, UIL, and they're very interested in developing new skills and competencies to transform regions into learning cities. And this can be done formally through the UNESCO Global Network of Learning Cities, or less formally. The Pascal International Observatory, where I am Deputy Director for Europe, is also perhaps an easier route to getting involved in learning city work. We have several hubs throughout the world, and it does everything from academic research to policy making, consulting, and so on. So just a teeny tiny little bit about the key features of a learning city. You can go ahead and Google this document. It's the 2013 Beijing document on key features of a learning city, and it came up with 42 indicators and specifically how they might be measured. But you can see that at the bottom, at the base of this structure is vision, political will, and commitment, which is easier said than done, I think, sometimes. Sometimes there's a very big commitment to, say, inclusion or sustainable learning, but perhaps not in the action. So the second thing is the governance and participation of all stakeholders in the city or the city region, and mobilization and utilization of resources and potentials. The things at the top are the things that we want to achieve. And you can see that these relate to the Sustainable Development Goals, in the middle, lifelong learning for all, in particular, relating to the SDG 4, but there's also the goals of not just economic, but also cultural prosperity, which I think is interesting. Empowerment and social cohesion, which is something missing in smart cities and future cities, as well as alongside sustainable development. So here's just a tiny example of how we might go about measuring it. And we've done some work at Urban Big Data Center with a large scale survey called Understanding Glasgow, We have a webinar up on the subject if you want to learn more about how you might go about measuring this in your own Learning City context. But for instance, you can measure empowering individuals and promoting social cohesion through the number of people voting, volunteering, other types of civic participation, also cultural engagement, measuring museums and informal spaces of learning. So that's just one example, but you can see here 3.3 talks about literacies, which is in the title of my talk. Literacies in the UNESCO sense, I will go into in the next slide. So what is a life-wide literacy? You've probably heard of lifelong learning from cradle to grave, which is a bit of a grim tagline, but you might be less familiar with life-wide learning, which means this little circle diagram here, that it's not just the formal learning that we're interested in for learning cities and successful learning cities. It's also non-formal learning happens in a classroom and leads to a formal qualification. Non-formal learning is also quite structured, but doesn't lead to a formal qualification, such as learning a language. And informal learning is much harder to capture because it's learning that occurs in daily life, in your family, in the workplace, in your community, through your own personal interests and activities, as the quote there says. And so you can see that increasingly with COVID, this type of learning is happening online. It's happening in and led by communities. It's happening led by the individual and their preferences. It can be for such a lot of different reasons, but it's really important, I think UNESCO would agree, that we start to capture these literacies. And among them, we've got health literacy, which is so important now during COVID, because it's not just 3 apples a day. It is much more about empowerment over your own health, how to fill out forms, who do you approach for different health conditions. It's taking control over your health. Likewise, financial literacy. And so we had in our own work some little quizzes that measured this. So financial literacy has a very popular measure by Lusardi and Mitchell that looks at things like compound interest and assessing stock market risk. So there are ways to assess these. There's a little bit less on eco-literacy. There are some great, though, smaller organizations have done, parks, recreation, have done surveys on eco-literacy and quiz questions like about the ozone layer and risks to extinction of animal species. So they are out there, but I think today I'm focused a little bit more on digital literacies, because again, in light of COVID, digital literacies, and again, not just the skills, but the feeling empowered over the digital, is going to be increasingly important for widening inequalities or preventing widening inequalities moving forward. So just to make it really clear that UNESCO's definition of life-wide literacy is the ability to identify, understand, interpret, create, communicate, and compute using printed and written materials associated with varying contexts. So it really is about enabling people to participate fully in the community around them and the wider society. And so you can see how digital literacy is key currently, is essential for being able to participate fully in communities and wider societies. And it links to health literacy. You know, increasingly having to be online is important for your health. And it links to financial literacy, because being able to bank online is increasingly important to your finances, and so on. So this talk is just to highlight that we have a briefing paper coming up. It's not yet come out, but we wrote a blog on the subject at UBDC. So in brief, our paper takes the Learning City framework. It considers other frameworks like smart cities and future cities. And within them, it tries to operationalize the importance of digital and data literacies, which are very closely connected. So it tries to look at the increasing use of data in our world and what it means to really feel empowered over that or with that, rather than disempowered, disenfranchised. as a result of people harvesting your data and increasingly things feeling out of your reach. So that's what the paper is about. It does touch upon the digital divide narrative briefly in terms of the current issues and what next. It was written pre-COVID, but our blog considers the paper within a post-COVID context. And so it's important then to consider the vulnerabilities that we identified within the current state of online play, as it will. And we identified risks along 4 critical lines. The first, obviously, access and poor technical infrastructure, which is something many of us are facing right now as we try to work and homeschool. The second is of digitally marginalized groups and communities. So particularly older adults who are most at risk in COVID are also most at risk of digital exclusion, and also people in areas of deprivation. Related also to digital knowledge, literacies, and practices. So this is saying that even if you have access, even if you don't feel, even if you're not a particularly digitally marginalized group, you might yourself lack the skills, competencies, and resources to engage fully in online living. And the last is political will, policy development, and economic priorities for the digital. So for each of these, I will very, very briefly discuss the case study that we chose for our paper. So the first case study in relation to the technical infrastructure risk comes from Giza, the Giza Governorate in Egypt, donated by Dr. Gaith Fariz from UNESCO, who presented their work on a technology enabling program with 443 women and 200 girls and women, funded by private corporations, but providing them with mobile phones, with digital apps to present an integrated curriculum of Arabic and maths, but also with social, cultural, and economic priorities. They offered the mobile phones and Wi-Fi in mosques, NGOs, health units, youth centers, and schools. So they really reached into the community and found that after this, 92% of these women passed the Adult Education Authority exam with the help of their digital apps. I'm not sure how many would have passed beforehand, but you can see that it was creating certainly knowledge exchange, but also you can see it leading to this empowerment in other areas of these women's lives. The second case study comes from a GCRF, a Global Research Challenge Fund, which Lavinia Hirsu, my co-author, leads. It's between Iran and the Philippines and the UK, and it's trying to create an international network of academic and non-academic stakeholders. It's called Workers by Self-Design. And so it acknowledges, it looks at areas hit by war, natural disasters, any threatened unstable environments, and it tries to reach in and identify gaps, needs, and interventions for women's digital literacies. So you can see that it's reaching into marginalized groups in very unstable regions to facilitate women's active participation in those workplace markets. So it uses tech and technology exchange to bring women inventors together and share their experience. A lot of them have tech that's related to even local crafts and creation of local crafts and exchange of local crafts, 3D art exhibit sharing, and so on. So you can see that from traditional crafts and homemade products to tech-embedded clothing and ecotourism, this is tackling that vulnerability to digital exclusion. The third is from ourselves. It's a hashtag Life in Data project, which you can follow on Twitter. It's part of UBDC's remit to promote novel data usage and improve lives. Well, how can you do that if people can't use data or access data? So the Life in Data project tried to map what data literacy means, to look at data policy, and we worked with Wikimedia, Data Lab, Cities Alliance to try to operationalize the term, but then engage with social enterprises like Creative Sterling to help be involved in the evolving practice of new digital needs, in this instance for the creative industries. So Creative Sterling does things like coder dojos and maker labs to work with local artists to basically try to, I wouldn't say upskill, but to try and use knowledge exchange to provide the skills that the emerging creative industries in that region needs. So it was very paradigm shifting that the policy is robust for learnable open data in the UK. And Greg Singh is writing loads more about this for the UK government in particular. So watch out for that. And the last case study is Singapore's Skills Future movement, which I was very lucky to go to Singapore as part of the UNESCO UIL expert panel on learning city metrics and how we actually do try to use novel approaches to capturing what's going on, especially what's capturing the learning going on online. So this is very much the fourth risk had to do more with upskilling and employment, but showing that there's a national political or local government strategy in place to support this. So the UNESCO UIL IAL Singapore workshop, that's the Institute for Adult Learning, measured lifelong learning in the face of transforming skills globally. And so Singapore has a national skills strategy called Skills Future, which you can visit online, which has an online portfolio. So people who were losing their jobs in the face of economic disruption or change were able to create their own digital profiles, their own individual learning career profiles with labor market information, and that could identify and link them almost like a matching service to training aligned with their needs and the local industry needs. So it made predictive recommendations, not just on training courses, but also on job openings. So you can read more about that by Michael Fung and his team. So in conclusion, just wrapping up, I know this might seem like a hugely all-encompassing talk and so much going on, but there are a few key lessons to be learned here in terms of the digital divide and digital empowerment. And that is that at the heart of digital literacy is data empowerment. So if people are scared or fearful or anxious about their data, how their data is used, what to do with data, it will make people feel marginalized from the digital world. So these two things go hand in hand, digital empowerment and data empowerment. And so there are a lot of initiatives trying to bring people to the digital and data table so that it's not the same voices being heard. We need to look at who's being left out. We need to particularly look at less formal types of online learning. Learning R now is not something you need to go to a formal course for, although there's Coursera and so on, but open science frameworks are really about trying to bring these skills and make them more accessible. There's so many webinars going on right now during COVID that I wonder how it will change the face of formal learning moving forward. So there needs to be more reaching in at the regional or even national level, reaching into libraries, museums, communities, workplace learning, and really engaging people holistically, teaching them to work with data, to triangulate data, to work interdisciplinary, to work across stakeholders, and to acknowledge that a lot of these privacy and security tensions and a lot of these worried about what's going on with my data and how I'm being tracked and how I'm being used are very legitimate. So policy also needs to, in line with the work of Greg Singh, push for openness and transparency in terms of the digital and life and data. We need citizens to want to engage with their communities online, with their local governments online. We want people to feel heard and to be included. in the decisions and the implementation of technology at the policy level. We don't want people to feel like tracing apps for COVID are forced upon them or so on. We want them to feel engaged and to say, okay, I need to engage with this app because keeping myself safe keeps my community safe. So if we think about researching with and not on, and we think about digital literacy as empowerment rather than just skills, we'll be making a step towards a more inclusive learning city and realizing the sustainable development goals and those top positive outcomes of a culturally and economically prosperous, socially inclusive, and sustainable learning city. So that is my journey as a social psychologist with the UNESCO Learning Cities framework, and also a taste of what Urban Big Data Center can do and can offer in terms of this data empowerment and engaging with new forms of technology to improve our cities. So thank you so much for listening. Go ahead and get in contact with me on Twitter at Catherine Lido. It's been an absolute pleasure, and I hope you enjoy the rest of the conference talks. Thank you so much. Have a great day.